Peter taught me a question very early on, and I use it I do 12 to 15 calls a day, 2,000, 70 to 80 calls a week, and 2,000 interviews a year. And I use that question every single time. And that is, I usually send them an email and I ask them any surprises. It doesn't matter if they've just had an interview, if I've known the person for years and they've just come out of an interview, or I've sent them into the big boss's office, any surprises. And it is a binary answer. If they come out and say no, you know that this is a person that is not curious, that isn't an optimist, because anyone that meets anything for the first time will always find something surprising. It doesn't matter if you're meeting the garbage man out front. Like, you can find something beautiful and interesting and surprising in any business, any bad idea, any failed founder. And think about that for a second. If you're taking 2,000 meetings a year for 20 years, as Kevin still does, as Joe Lonsdale still does, I think you have to be an optimist. Like, you have to be constantly learning. I think that these are tremendously dynamic people that continually evolve and learn. They've had to put up with my antics and my eccentricities. I think it's because they're curious and malleable themselves.
What stands out to you? What else have you learned specifically from Peter Thiel?
Well, this may get me in trouble.
All right, welcome back to another episode of HR Heretics. Today, we have an amazing guest. We have Peterson Conway on with us. Peterson's background is quite interesting. He was at Xoom in the early days. That's Xoom with an X. Like, now we're using Zoom with a Z. And you could tell it's like 2 generations removed because it's like the same name, just spelled differently. But what was interesting about that company is it was acquired by PayPal. And this is in the days of the PayPal Mafia. And Peterson has worked very closely with people like Peter Thiel and Joe Lonsdale and many of the PayPal Mafia. He's been at Founders Fund. He helped construct the early Palantir team. And so, Peterson, I'm so excited to have you on today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm a big consumer of your material here.
Love it. All right. Let's talk about your early career. So I kind of gave the lead in of like, you ended up at Xoom, which was acquired by PayPal. How did that come about? Like, tell us about that story and what happened there.
Well, if anyone is familiar with the Peter Sellers movie Being There, where this gardener kind of constantly, Chancey the gardener, wanders in to various mansions, the presidential Oval Office, and he's a complete idiot. But he seems blessed with good luck, and he ends up dispensing massive economic advice and all of these things, and taken for a real genius. And that's my nickname at 8VC is Chancey.
Oh my God.
That's incredible.
But I'll give you the quick answer because it's a good one. I got lucky. I was a humanities major, barely got through Dartmouth, flunked my only CS class there, and had this idea that I wanted to, very liberal arts, romantic idea that I wanted to work in a warehouse where I could ride my motorcycle into it. And I had tried going into investment banking. Peter Thiel has a lot of theories about, if you're really smart, you have but 3 choices. You either go into medicine, if you're really smart, but you don't have any technical capacity, you go into medicine, you go into law, or you go into banking. And I was a terrible banker, but sitting at home after 2 years of that, day trading my 401k, which is an awful way to make a living. And I got this idea in my head, and I jumped on my motorcycle and I rode south of Market, and I found the first open door, and I literally rode my motorcycle in there. And lo and behold was Kevin Hartz and Keith Rabois and David Sachs, and they were literally in a meeting, if I recall, and they were building, PayPal was a thing. It was the dominant payments platform out there. They had yet to take it public or sell it. And they were just building applications on top of those. And those would become Eventbrite. Those would become Xoom. And I got lucky, rolled in there. They thought I was nuts. I later brought an Airstream later brought my dogs, and I think I was just kept around because I was weird,
But
and I just did anything to make myself useful.
Peterson, I have to ask this. Like, you didn't know these people before
No
you
clue.
did
In
this?
fact,
You didn't
when I met
know
Kevin,
you didn't
when
know
I
they were
met
going to be
Kevin,
there?
no, when I met Kevin, literally he said, we work with Peter Thiel, and I said, who's that? I had no idea.
I just want to unpack this for 2 minutes because I'm an HR freak, and I just
That
want
sounds
to
like
know
a security risk.
I just want to know what it takes. Like, what is going through someone's mind and body to get on a cycle and ride up Market Street and just go into a random warehouse? Like, what was that moment where you were like, I'm going to get my key or however you start your bike, and I'm going to go into this fucking warehouse. I don't even know if
Well,
anyone's
that's
in
what happens when you're day trading your 401k at home. You become a little nutty.
Oh, you go loony. Okay.
And this is what's happening to all of us, by the way, in a hybrid and work remote environment. We're just
Yeah.
becoming a little nutty.
Yeah. That's what
Amen, brother.
DHA said on our episode, Nolan. And I
Interesting.
agree. I've never
so
day
I
traded
literally
401k.
I found a roll-up door. There was a nice security guard outside. There was a ramp because he was unloading. There was like an antique thing, and they had the next door, and so they had a ramp for carrying heavy objects. And I just thought it would be funny if I rode my ramp right up there. And that guy later became a friend. But he said, "Well, let me take you around. You seem like you'd fit right in here with all these misfits."
Holy shit. Okay,
Love that.
so you show up and then you somehow start like recruiting people is what I can ascertain from your LinkedIn profile.
Kind of. Yeah. Like I said, I was a humanities major, and I just started bringing coffee, lunch, Indian food, motorcycles, surfboards, Airstreams, anything I could. And I had a tiny little bit of money. I think my 401k was like 25 grand at the time, and I put it all on Kevin. So Kevin was building then what was called Mollyguard, and these were just a bunch of different products on top of PayPal, just trading on their money licensing, flagrantly and illegally, by the way. And he had the men's bathroom was papered in cease and desist letters from states, various U.S. states, telling him to stop. And we proceeded, and I basically got into this role for Kevin of opening up really hard to reach doors, because as a humanities major, I like to write. So I wrote old-fashioned letters, put them in a FedEx envelope, sent them off, and we get a meeting with the largest bank in India. And I jump on a plane and go to India and open up a distribution relationship for Xoom, and then go on to the next one in the Philippines, and just repeat.
I'm trying to, have this sink in. I mean, a lot of people talk about, and you've alluded to this in some article, that like the magic of Silicon Valley and the dream and all these things. I mean, that story, is that magic? Like, these things don't happen. They do happen.
I agree with you. I think good things happen to good people.
Yeah.
I think, you may not like this on your podcast, but the smartest, the best looking, the richest are not the ones that always win. It's the most affable often.
Yeah. No, we like that on our podcast.
That is well said. That is really well said. And for our audience, if you don't know, Kevin Hartz was not only the co-founder of Xoom with an X, also a venture partner at Founders Fund, but most importantly, what you probably know him as is the co-founder of Eventbrite.
And much more. There's a great backstory real quick to Kevin. So Kevin was head of the Democratic student body at Stanford, and Peter Thiel famously was anything but. And so they were almost, arch rivals. But, Kevin at SGI had also a little, beer and chip money pile, and he started putting everything he had into anything Peter did. And they eventually became friends. Now, of course, the rest is history. But Kevin went on to invest in PayPal, Palantir, Airbnb, Pinterest, Oculus, Anduril. The guy is a generational investor.
So cool. Okay, so you have supported legends in Silicon Valley, and I want to talk a little bit about it, because some of these people, like Peter, like Keith, like Joe Lonsdale, are known to be brutal to work with. And you've been working with them for now 2 decades, going on 2 decades plus. How have you survived that?
My wife would like to know the answer to that as well. I think the most important thing I would share on that is loyalty. It's not a Silicon Valley value, and they have seen me through hard things, and I have stuck with them when Kevin Hartz famously put a trash can on my head.
Can you
I think
elaborate on that story, please?
yes, he didn't like my performance. He stuck me actually in his office and monitored my phone calls, and at one point didn't like it was the sheer volume. I just wasn't making enough calls. And he literally walked over, picked up the trash can filled with food, and placed it on my head.
Holy shit!
And later had that story got out, and in due diligence for Eventbrite, I got approached to explain that story.
I was gonna say a little hostile work environment. I'm not sure here.
we've all grown up, and frankly, I deserved it.
Yeah,
it's an interesting point that you say that we've all grown up, because one of the things that I've learned is that people change. And people do grow up. And especially like when you're early in your career, I haven't heard anything that fucking crazy, candidly, in my career, but like, people are emotional.
Yeah.
And they grow past that. But how have you survived through this?
I think that they have been, they found me a curiosity and in the beginning. And later, I had a singular, Peter Thiel has a theory that in starting a company, everybody wants to do everybody else's job. And this is the problem with generalists. They say specialization is for insects. When you're starting a company and you're 10 people, everybody has to be, profoundly focused on what they're good at. And I was lucky to have just one skill. And that was a needle that bounced when I was close to good people. And I think that, riding my motorcycle up that ramp and into that warehouse, I'll take full credit for that. I'll take full credit for seeing that Kevin was an unusual guy. And that's the one skill set I've traded on my whole life. I'm a wannabe writer. I'm a wannabe pilot. I'm a terrible father and farmer, but I'm a very good judge of character.
Yeah. Peterson, we talk a lot on this show about, difficult leaders, difficult founders, and how to work with them, sometimes survive them, but also to like change them and influence them and be a force in that evolution. I'm just curious how and if you've played that role with them over the years, and, some advice or how you did that.
Another way to frame that question is like, what is the winning question when you're meeting somebody? And I'll get to, you'll see where this is going. But Peter taught me a question very early on, and I use it I do 12 to 15 calls a day, 70 to 80 calls a week, and 2,000 interviews a year. And I use that question every single time. And that is, I usually send them an email and in advance, and I ask them any surprises. It doesn't matter if they've just had an interview, if I've known the person for years and they've just come out of an interview, or I've sent them into the big boss's office, any surprises. And it is a binary answer. If they come out and say no, you know that this is a person that is not curious, that isn't an optimist, because anyone that meets anything for the first time will always find something surprising. It doesn't matter if you're meeting the garbage man out front. Like, you can find something beautiful and interesting and surprising in any business, any bad idea, any failed founder. And think about that for a second. If you're taking 2,000 meetings a year for 20 years, as Kevin still does, as Joe Lonsdale still does, I think you have to be an optimist. Like, you have to be constantly learning. And so to answer your question specifically, like, I think that these are tremendously dynamic people that continually evolve and learn. So providing, the fact that they've had to put up with my antics and my eccentricities, I think it's because they're curious and malleable themselves.
Yeah.
And
I don't know what it's like to be their accountant, because I bet you they're not very curious there. But when it comes to people, you got to be curious.
Maybe there's some surprises, though.
Yeah.
I want to pull the thread of, Peter. I've heard Keith talk about Peter a lot. and a lot about, Keith's learnings and interview questions. What stands out to you? What else have you learned specifically from Peter Thiel?
Well, this may get me in trouble, but the first thing you're hit with Peter is almost this tormented intelligence. When remember when the sitcom or whatever it was, Silicon Valley came out, and I was so excited because I was down to seeing Peter about once a year at the Christmas party sort of thing. This wasn't that long ago, I guess, and I went up to Peter all eager, and there were a bunch of us all eager there that he was at the Christmas party, and I said, Peter, what did you think about how you were portrayed in Silicon Valley? And he stopped and he looked up into the corner, like autistically, in this horribly long silence. And I was terrified that I had asked him this question because I thought for sure he was going to just lay me flat for like the differences between communism and Marxism, some profound answer. And he goes, well, for starters, I would never drive a car that small.
Wow.
I have no idea what your question was, but that's my favorite Peter Thiel story.
So I love that story. I want to know what else did you learn from him?
Well, I think everybody's read his book, 0 to 1, or it's on all of our shelves. And I think everybody should go back and read that book. I think it's a foundational text for the new economy, but also, frankly, for being a good human being. Peter taught me really early on to look for those people that really just weren't managing to be popular, that were naturally curious, that were thinking about things on a massive scale. And then I'll teach you one little thing that he taught me that I thought was very interesting. He said, never manage a zero inbox. He said, there are two types of people in the world, and he loves these two types of people. He had these theories about people that live on ridges versus people that live in the valleys. But he said, there's two types of managers, those that manage a zero inbox and those that don't. And I said, would you love to have someone running your company that is that tight, that is like getting their mailbox down to zero? He goes, no, that's being reactive. That's letting somebody else tell you how you're going to spend your day. And very interestingly, when you look at Joe Lonsdale's schedule or Kevin Hartz's schedule, there are these huge blocks that are not scheduled every day when they walk into the office. Because these people walk in and think about what is the most important thing I need to get done today and get that person on the phone. And that's what I do for a living.
Peterson, what wasn't he good at? What did you see, or what did he admit that
in the early days,
terrible at?
In the early days, Joe, Kevin, Peter, this is unfair of me to say now, but I think like what they were not good at is what I've already told you what I think I'm good at is I think just seeing, Peter in 0 to 1 writes a lot about tribes and overlapping values. And when you are coming of age in a computer science department or in law school even, there's a lot of people that are similar. Everyone around you is similar. And I think that that's really important when you're building a company. But when you're trying to bring in new talent, especially in areas that you haven't built things in the past, you can be a terrible judge of talent because you've only seen one type of person. And I would say of all three of those, Joe Lonsdale is probably the best at dealing with outliers, really, seeing a glint of something and taking a chance on somebody.
Hey, everyone. We'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
There's a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and deeply intuitive. Attio makes that a reality. Attio is a radically new CRM built specifically for the new era of companies. It's flexible, easily configures to your unique data structures, works for any go-to-market motion from self-serve to sales-led. Attio automatically enriches your contacts, syncs your emails and calendar, lets you create powerful reports, and quickly build Zapier-style automations. The next era of companies deserves more than a one-size-fits-all CRM with an outdated UX. Join 11 labs, replicate, modal, and more. Try Attio instantly at attio.com. That's ATTIO.com, and tell them Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretic sent you. I want to talk about an article you recently wrote, and it has an interesting title. The title is Butthole Notorious.
That's my favorite one, actually. That's cool that you zeroed in on it.
Can you tell our audience what it's about and what caused you to write it?
You bet. Joe has a podcast, of course, called The American Optimist. And I hold Joe obviously in the highest regard. Not all of our views overlap. And I'm the son of a farmer, or the grandson of a farmer, but I was a farm kid. And, I was raised in the summers working on a farm. I can barely to this day update the software on my cell phone. But I'm an American, and I felt like, Joe had it backwards, frankly. And, so I became interested in optimist, American. And I'd written a piece previously about David Packard. I grew up in Carmel, and which was the capital of Spanish California, Monterey. So there's a lot of big original Spanish land grants down here, and a lot of Silicon Valley has come down and bought these big ranches. And David Packard was the first to do that. And so that first article was really about how these people that are going up against these massive industries, whether it's defense, or building software for the first time, they're not running popularity contests. They're jerks. They're assholes. And so that piece kind of came out of a play of those two things.
It's really interesting. There's a couple of quotes that I love. One is, a threatened bureaucracy will cut off its own nose when threatened by a heretic. Can you explain, what does that mean? Like, explain that to us.
Human beings are fundamentally driven by one single thing, and that's a need to connect. And unfortunately, as we connect and our organizations grow bigger, we also slow down. And my view is that these groups then take on the animated properties of a human being themselves, and they will do anything at that point to survive. We see this with 60% of our country's GDP in some way tied to the U.S. government now.
Right.
And we're going to preserve that base at all costs. We're going to preserve that being this, whether it's a corporation or a government or an organization at all costs. And I think the tricky part of this is balancing being an individual, because we live in a hyper individualized culture. This is my favorite subject right here. The crisis of the individual. And this is the dirty little secret, is that, unless you've got a really good reason to do something differently, you better stick with the status quo. And at the same time, everything has a lifespan, most of all big organizations and even governments.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing pice, by the way. We'll link it in the show notes. I strongly encourage everybody to read it. It's
a lot of fun. I'll just say one thing on that. My wife wrote in comedy, and so every piece I write, but especially that one, we really worked on together. And so I write these long, terrible things, and she cuts them down by 75%. But as she says, she punches it up, and she's really, really great at making these things a lot more fun. That's a little shout out to Kelsey. Yeah. That's
super cool that your wife is your editor and also helping you, write a piece called Butthole Notorious. Like, that sounds like a great relationship.
She has the mouth of a sailor.
We should have her on here. She'd fit in perfectly.
You would love her.
Yeah, I think the lifespan comment is interesting. I've been doing HR around here, Peterson, for about 24 years. And, the notorious companies like the Yahoos, who were in their heyday and then they dwindled away and everyone kind of cries and is sad. And I remember talking about this a few times over the past 15 years. I'm like, look, does everyone think that companies are going to live forever? I don't know if it's possible. And I just like we talk about the elements of retention and keeping people at companies now is just, it doesn't have to be taboo. Perhaps, companies having a lifespan and knowing that things come to an end also shouldn't be taboo.
Well, Nolan gave me a little tip here that we're going to talk about the future towards, later in the episode. So we'll get to some of this, but the future of employment is going to radicalize in many ways, and these cycles are going to get shorter. Yeah. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to steal your thunder on that one for later.
So Kelli, on that point,
yep,
humans love safety, and what Peterson mentioned has been a thread I've been thinking about recently with the government. It's about 60% now of all jobs in the United States are now tied to government in some way or another. Like if you're at Boeing and you're making missiles, right? Like the government is the buyer of those missiles. But like state governments are getting bigger, local governments are getting bigger. And my take on it, as I've been thinking about it for the last couple of weeks, is I think it's because of safety and because we don't know what's on the other side of not having this job anymore. Peterson, what's your take on that?
I love that you're bringing this up. This is the whole issue with connectivity, is that you can't connect with somebody unless you trust them. And that trust is fundamentally a driver of safety. Our brains are wired for this. If you look at our fear of rejection, it actually is buried deep in our amygdala, which from an evolutionary biological perspective should tell us how important this is. Think about that. Ejection from the clan, your safety in numbers,
yes.
All of that. And so in this era of expansive government, it starts with, being liked on Facebook. I mean, what an awful concept, right? Being friended, even being connected with on LinkedIn, what I do for a living. These are awful, awful concepts, but they are neurologically tapping into something so important. And at the same time, like it's having its way with us. I completely agree with you.
They're very addictive because of that. And we talk a lot about fear on this show, Peterson, when it comes to, in the organization, right? The culture, feedback, communication, that fear of being rejected, i.e. being fired, losing your job, not being good, not being liked. It drives everything.
Well, I agree with that. I would just add fear and love. I think that I talked a second ago about everything being driven by connection. And if you dig into that a little bit, it's really motivated that, whether, when you kicked your dogs out before this interview or you even showed up here, every single thing you do in life is driven by one of those two things, fear or love. When I rode my motorcycle up that ramp, that was pure love. When Kevin put the trash can on my head, that was pure fear. And here's just the mind bender, and we don't have to get into this today, but I actually think they're the same thing.
Interesting.
That's a Zen perspective.
Let me tangent this a little bit, because I see just from a therapy session, it's preventative care. I go like once every 2 months. And
I think everybody should do
everybody
therapy.
Should.
I go twice a week. In fact, right after this, I'm going to therapy.
I love it. There was a time where it was once every 2 weeks, but now it's once every 2 months. So here we go. Guilt and
By the way,
shame.
when you work for Joe and Kevin, you need to go twice a week.
Oh, there we go. Do they go or just you?
I don't think I should comment on that.
Okay, yeah.
But I will tell you that I've asked them to talk to my therapist.
That's incredible. Fear and love. I agree. I love it. How do you see guilt and shame fitting into that equation? I have talked about that quite a bit.
Yeah, they're very powerful because, of course, to Nolan's point that fear. We want safety, and safety is just another mechanism for avoiding vulnerability. And there's just so much work or so much stuff on this topic that it's not mine to pontificate on, Brene Brown and such. But I think vulnerability is an incredibly powerful thing, including oversharing, including coming at people with your guilt.
Right.
These are force multipliers that can be used for good and bad.
Interesting.
It's just the last piece on this thread is like, I think the one thing, I'm an outsider. I've never met, Peter or Joe. I have met Keith before. But it seems like the one thing all of them have in common is no filter.
Yeah, I was talking about being buried deep in the amygdala, and sometimes I wonder, where's the prefrontal cortex?
Right.
I remember. Here's a good story for you with Peter. This very eager software engineer comes running up to him. Peter has this theory about conferences: only go to a conference if you're going to speak at it. And this is one of the early TED conferences, and when it was held here in my hometown, Carmel, Monterey, and this eager kid comes up to him and starts just vomiting on him, just telling him his life story and about how Peter has changed it and influenced it. And any one of us here would have just been so kind to this person and just been so grateful that this person would approach us with their life story. And I remember Peter doing the same thing. I talked about looking up in the right-hand corner. He looks up and then he looks and he goes, "I'm sorry, I'm just really not into this conversation." And doesn't walk off.
Just
stands there. So let's take something positive out of that. It's discomfort.
Right.
How often can any of us just be uncomfortable? And I think that these, Kevin, Joe, Peter, we can call them awkward, inappropriate, no filter. How about just calling them tough? How about just saying, and I don't mean tough on others. I mean like just sitting with something hard.
I love that story. I'm thinking about using that move a little bit. What did the kid do?
I got the kid. I felt so bad for him. I think I gave him a hug. Yeah. And I think he goes to therapy now with me or something.
That's so amazing because it does encapsulate like what I know and the stories that I've heard about that trio of people. And, I learned something interesting from Henry, who's the CEO of Carta, that there's power in silence.
Amen.
And most people don't embrace silence. They want to fill the airtime. And just being quiet and sitting with something that feels really awkward often is a very powerful move in a discussion.
100%.
This is a perfect follow-up to your point just a second ago about guilt and vulnerability, because silence is the most vulnerable thing. And I talked about, being kicked off the college radio. As long as you're talking, it's hard to get kicked off. But in silence, that's when you take your shots.
God, that's good, man. Okay. I want to get into team construction now.
This part is going to be far less interesting. I'm a terrible team builder. You've billed me at this. I'll be quiet.
Okay. This is so fucking
brilliant.
good.
Brilliant.
Okay. You have helped build some of the most generational companies of our time. What is the secret to company construction?
That first hire. Everybody talks. Everybody asks me. Founders come to me all the time when we're onboarding them. I have 300 to 400 portfolio companies now. And the first thing that they always ask me is like, tell me about team culture. These, young, eager kids, maybe 19 years old and has dropped out of MIT. Tell me about team culture. And I always tell them the same thing. It is an extension of the founder. And that holds true, I think, for your first 10 hires. So one thing I want to say on this point is a bit of a contrarian point. Everybody looks for those 10X hires that define that team culture. What nobody ever talks about is avoiding that one toxic hire, because that will do more damage to building teams than anything. When you're 10 people and you're grinding and you're working 100-hour weeks, and then the person at your side gets offed for any reason, they were a toxic hire or whatever, a company can lose so much time in trying to re-put itself back together. You're trying to perambulate around on regrown limbs. But the most concise answer there is like looking for that first outside hire. We talk a lot about recruiting internally in our known networks, and we have some very specific ratios about how much of our outreach has to be outside of those networks, so that we're constantly bringing in new blood. We own recruiting out of Stanford, CS recruiting out of Stanford.
Right.
That's a well-known fact. Look at Palantir.
Yep.
Well, now we're spending a lot of time with these tier 2 schools, places where people might have a chip on their shoulder. places where people are learning to fight from the bottom. But those, of identifying that early 10x hire is the most important thing to do.
It's really interesting. And so when you say like the pipeline from Stanford, I'm assuming you're referring to 8VC, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Why? I am surprised you guys are starting to look at tier 2 schools, because there's always been like this, or at least historically, there's been an elitism that I've seen from you guys in your recruiting practices.
That's very fair.
And so why are you changing now?
Yeah. Well, some of it's practical. When you're in an engineering, particularly rocketry or robotics, some of the state schools, you look at Michigan, Cal Poly, like the difference in the quality of education just isn't there. Like, I just don't see the differentiator. Meanwhile, I think that we're doing a lot of these kids an injustice at these top schools about constantly telling them how great they are. I mean,
yes.
You can go look at the recent, interview with the CEO and founder of NVIDIA.
Jensen Huang, NVIDIA.
Yeah,
yep.
Unbelievable. I encourage everybody to look at that.
Everyone needs to watch it. Totally agree.
Yeah. Maybe you can share a link to that here. But, so part of it's just practical. There are really good kids at state schools. And then the part that I like the best is just, the softer side. A lot of these, we look for, we have this philosophy of give a busy kid a job and the job gets done. So looking for kids that, one of the keywords that we use on LinkedIn is varsity, is athlete, is captain. We look for people that, had jobs. We look for people that worked 2 jobs at the same time. And you see it, like I have a candidate right now that is, without telling his employers, I'm not endorsing this, but he's literally working at 2 Elon companies at the same time. And
pedigree.
Nobody knows.
Yeah, it's interesting. The pedigree of the past that was thought of as a positive signal is like Stanford, Harvard, Yale. I think
it's a mistake to over-index on education, but I still understand. When it comes to talent, I know I'm interrupting you here. I also want to point out the weaknesses in the arguments that I'm making. When we talk to really good talent people, we almost always want them either A, never have worked in talent, or B, have gone to a good school, because it takes great to recognize great. And so I just want to poke some holes in my own arguments here.
Yeah, I do think the pedigree of the future, though, is going to be a lot more around grit.
How do you? Yeah, that's a great point. I just wonder how you measure it, but yeah.
I think you described it: working 2 jobs, being an athlete, and a great student.
It's what you do in your life.
Well, yeah. Okay. And you talked earlier about what's happening with the expansion of government and the seeking of safety. I think sitting with hard things, people just don't do. Life just got way too easy. So in many ways, California, and I know I'm digressing, you can edit this out, but California doesn't look that different from Italy. We are a lifestyle state now. We produce great olive oil, great wine, and drive beautiful cars, and the hills are studded with beautiful oak trees.
Yeah.
Kelli, we need to do that segment on the bill that they're trying to pass right now in California, that you can't text me after 5 p.m.
For sure. I'm born and raised here too, Peterson. It's changed.
A native Californian, great. Yeah.
Ton.
Yeah, this is interesting. We have a no auto reply policy at APC. And we're currently being sued, actually, by a former employee for texting them at 4 and 5 in the morning.
Oh, well.
Maybe you guys were the basis of the idea to pass the legislation.
Look at the fine text, the fine print. Peterson's in there. Peterson, I do have
what my client means to say.
I have just one more question. And in all your time working with your portfolio companies and whatnot, I'm just curious your experience with your observations on the HR function in general, HR leaders, the CHRO, CEO founder relationship. I'm sure you have thoughts, opinions, or experiences. I just love your take.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own definition of like when a company is, culture, changes, and people love to say, when you hire HR, and there's a well-known battle drawn between recruiters like me and HR that see each other as their, and I don't hold any of those views. I think HR, when done right, makes people familiar with the performance standards of a global company. But I'll tell you what we do look for in hiring our first people officers. It's either an engineering or a law background, so that they've been operationally involved.
Wow.
Good HR people have managed a P&L. And so, if I were, I would never be hired, to, loose lip sink ships guy. But, I would be looking, to gain operational experience, P&L responsibility, like really having your own survival on the line. Then you really understand.
Yeah. Is that a hard and fast rule, Peterson? I mean, you would never hire someone if they didn't have that. Is that
no? I'm not a hard and fast rule guy, but as I'm thinking about specific people that I would point out right now, they actually came. Peter, well-known, law guy, law student. He was in one of those rubrics, right? And we love hiring people from law backgrounds because they're. Keith, yes.
David Sachs.
They are very good at thinking several moves down the chessboard. Very good at anticipating counterparty motivations.
Mm-hmm.
So they make, they make great chief people officers.
It's super interesting. Can you tell us the Palantir story and the early Palantir team story specifically?
I don't think that that's my story to tell, but I will tell you, my limited early day vantage point. So, and it relates directly to the motorcycle story. There was a first hire both at Xoom and later at Palantir, well-known guy, godfather of one of my daughters, Shyam Sankar. And he was at Stanford, and he had built a remittance business to, basically had done in his dorm room what we were trying to do with, $10 or $20 million from Peter. This kid was doing on his own in a dorm room at Stanford. And I dragged him in and kind of wound him up and put him in front of everybody. I'm like, tell them what you just told me. And he went up, he's like, this is why you're going to fail. And he did his thing, and we hired him on the spot. Shyam went on to build Xoom's product and then later be their head of business development. And we hired Joe Lonsdale as an intern at Xoom. And that was the early beginnings of Palantir. What I want to tell you here, the most interesting kind of non-Peterson perspective on this is, Peter set out when Joe and Peter and Shyam and everybody started out with Palantir, they wanted to organize the world's information, organize and analyze the world's information. It was like building an oracle from scratch. It was crazy. Palantir is older than Facebook. Consider that. But they defined a whole generation. They defined big data. And then they were smart enough to look at this and say, we don't want to bill for services. We want to build software, and we want to sell seats and access to that software. And it was an extraordinary vision at the time.
God, that's so cool. The thing that keeps coming up in this conversation, which is also another Peter Thielism, is finding undiscovered talent. Like you just mentioned, Joe came in as an intern.
Yeah.
How are you finding these people?
Well, I'll let you in on some of my secrets. I hate sharing these things because they literally are what we use on LinkedIn. So I'm going to get a lot of angry text messages from my team after this. We use very strange keywords, and we use very strange lists. One is chess champions, looking for people with a national chess score. We look for people that took the Latin exam. We look for people that were the best people always leave their country. Americans living abroad are, number for number, usually smarter, harder working, more curious than the ones that stayed at home. Just like we are a country of immigrants. So we have these weird LinkedIn features, filters, where we will actually build lists of the top engineering schools. And everybody does this for India, but I mean in Italy, I mean the Grande Écoles in France. And there are these mechanisms on LinkedIn where you can actually look for somebody that graduated from one of these schools, but is living in California. Mm. So these people, like Peter has this theory of like, it's great. Actually, this is a Trey Stevens. Trey Stevens speaks to this at least more frequently. When you hire somebody for faith, meaning that they are a Christian or they're Jewish or Muslim or whatever, one of his favorite questions is, did they choose to be that themselves? Like if they just did what their parents did, it's obviously less interesting. But I've been given a lot of crazy searches in the early days of Palantir where I had to go find, a Jew that was married to a Christian that was gay living from the outback of Australia. No joke. That was an actual search string I was given.
Why? What does that tell you?
Well, we were looking specifically at the time to build Asia Pacific region. We were doing that in Australia. And we were looking for people that were signals that they had done something very, very hard out of personal choice and conviction.
Mm-hmm. On their own.
On their own.
So this is an incredible aha moment for me. I've never heard this in my whole career. And
well, you're not allowed to say it.
I just, so if I get this right, Peterson, Peter is telling you these things. These theories are coming up.
Yeah, increasingly through his chief of staff, but yes.
Okay. So he looks up at the corner and he looks down and he says, go find me chess players now. Is that kind of how it works?
He looks up at the corner and he goes, fucking Peterson. That's actually another nickname.
Go find me a gay Jew that lives in, like, this is, I need to work with this guy. This is incredible. Yeah. Very interesting.
Peterson, we have to have you back.
We have to.
I feel like we've scratched the surface of my own personal curiosity of the inner workings of Founders Fund, 8VC, Palantir, and all of these amazing places that you've worked at. Please.
I want to tell you my greatest Peter Thiel story. I've never told anyone. And this is
we've broken him open.
Great risk. But during the Paris and Brussels bombings in Europe in 2014-15, I think it was, the French government couldn't be seen as working with a U.S. software company. And so we were holding all of these meetings, these clandestine meetings, basically in the hotel lobbies, these 5-star hotels that we wouldn't even be staying at. We would just set up there as if we were staying, and we would interview young software engineers who would show up not having any idea who had invited them. We couldn't say Palantir. I called my friend Trey at Founders Fund and I said, hey, I got to let you know what I'm doing. And he basically was like, blah, 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 I don't want to hear, because I printed my own Founders Fund stationery and I sent out letters. I literally hired a young gal to ride around on a moped around Paris, hand delivering letters. And for a while, if you Googled Peterson Conway, it auto-populated to Peterson Conway letter. I sent so many letters. And the only time I've ever been in the press, actually on the front cover of the New York Times, was because I was sending letters on behalf of Peter to getting kids to drop out of college. And I was getting all this hate mail from their mothers. But so I'd sent out these letters and I just signed it P, Peterson. But of course, there was some room for... So these kids would show up and it became this game of, could we get somebody to accept a job, get all the way through their interviews in this random hotel lobby, accept a job without ever knowing who the actual company was? And we succeeded at that. We built up a big team in France that later went on to run Airbus. But I had this kid. On my last day, I was getting to the airport and I had a couple of people with me and we were rushing at the airport and I was eager to get home. We'd held all these successful meetings. This kid shows up and he's got my letter and he sits down. He says, I just need a moment with you. And he says, I was at a dinner party with Peter Thiel last night and I showed him this letter and I just went white. I mean, at this point I was pretty removed, and I had somewhat covered my tracks with Trey, but I really had done something that I really shouldn't have done. And he goes, I want you to know that I'm on to you. And I just didn't know what to say, and I was silent. And he says, Peter denied this letter. And then I was doubly scared, and he goes, and I know that he actually sent it. And I'm like, you're right. I got to go to the airport.
And welcome aboard.
Yeah. And evidently,
Oh
I had sent the letter unknowingly to a company that Peter had funded, and he was there at a cocktail party with it. The founder was a friend of his, and this kid showed up with the letter. And this is the sort of shit that, that they, I guess, kind of look the other way and allow us to go after like the hardest to reach people, because the best people never look for a job.
That reminds me of my favorite value from the DoorDash early days, which is ask for forgiveness, not for permission.
Yes. Beg for forgiveness. That would, if I could figure out how to say that in Latin, I'd tattoo it on my shoulder. But there for the grace of God go I.
How do we get Peter on here is my question.
Oh my God, Peterson, this was so good.
This is so good.
Oh, thanks. I had a great
so
time.
Much for the time.
You guys are real pros. This was fun.
Oh, it was so fun. And the biggest takeaway is that you would never hire me as a CPO in your portfolio.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.